You have been in this moment before. The kitchen counter is cluttered. Dinner is going cold. You have already called their name twice, measured, then firm, and there has been no answer, no footsteps, no sign of movement from the other end of the hallway. You walk to the door. You push it open, and your child is sitting on the floor, back against the bed frame, eyes aimed at nothing in particular, not crying, not arguing, not even startled by your entrance. You take away the screen they were using. Nothing shifts in their expression. You tell them they are losing their weekend plans. The same blank surface. You raise your voice, something you told yourself you would not do tonight. And still there is nothing. No tears. No pushback. No negotiation. Just a silence so complete it feels almost physical, like a wall built specifically to keep you out. Most parents standing in that moment feel a tight, specific kind of frustration, because the silence reads as contempt. It reads as a child who has calculated that you are not worth the energy of a response. Every parenting instinct you carry, everything you were taught about consistency and consequences and holding firm, screams at you that this child needs a stronger reaction, a bigger consequence, a clearer demonstration that their behavior is unacceptable. And so you escalate. You reach for something that will finally land. That instinct is not only ineffective, it is operating on a completely false diagnosis of what you are actually seeing. The silence is not defiance, it is not manipulation, it is not strength, and the widespread belief that it is, reinforced by culture, by tradition, by well-meaning relatives who survive the same, may be causing compounding damage to the emotional development of your child in ways that will not become visible for years. What is actually happening in that silence is a neurological event, specific, traceable, and deeply ancestral. There is a mechanism embedded in the developing nervous system, documented across decades of research in attachment theory and autonomic neuroscience, that activates when emotional pressure reaches a threshold the brain cannot process through ordinary means. It is not widely discussed in mainstream parenting literature. It rarely makes it into the kind of advice you find on the first page of a search, and yet it is one of the clearest early indicators that the emotional bond between a parent and child is under structural strain, not just situational conflict, but something deeper. By the end of this video, that mechanism will have a name, a clear neurological explanation, and a set of behavioral markers that will let you distinguish between a child going through a difficult phase and a child whose nervous system has quietly entered a state of protective withdrawal. That distinction is not a small one. It changes everything about how you respond. Before we go further, have you seen this silence in your child? Drop a word in the comments. Yes, recently. Or describe what it felt like standing in that room. Your experience is part of this conversation. The interpretation that feels most natural, and that gets reinforced most often by people around you, is that a child who does not react to punishment has simply decided it does not affect them, that they are strong-willed, that they require a firmer hand. This explanation has the appeal of simplicity and the authority of tradition. It also fails at the level of basic developmental psychology. Discipline, in its actual psychological mechanism, does not function through pain or inconvenience alone. It functions through the threat of relational rupture. A child complies, not because the consequence is unpleasant, but because they fear the loss of warmth from the person they are attached to. The real currency of discipline is not the confiscated screen or the canceled outing. It is the implicit message that disappointing you creates a distance between you. The child behaves because they want to stay close. That desire for closeness, that fear of disconnection, is the engine underneath all of it, which means that when a child stops reacting, it is not because they have become immune to the consequence. It is because the fear of losing the connection has been replaced by a far heavier belief that the connection is already gone, or at minimum that it cannot be relied upon. When a child reaches that internal conclusion, consciously or not, the leverage of discipline evaporates entirely, because the system it was built on no longer exists for them. You are not dealing with a child who has outgrown your authority. You are dealing with a child who has quietly stopped believing that your approval is something they can actually hold on to. To understand what produces that silence, you have to follow the science below the level of behavior and into the physiology of the developing nervous system. The foundational framework here comes from Dr. Stephen Porges, a neuroscientist at Indiana University, whose Polyvagal Theory reshaped how researchers understand stress responses across the lifespan. Porges identified that the autonomic nervous system does not operate as a simple binary. It has three distinct and hierarchical states, and the movement between them is not a choice. It is a biological response to perceived safety and threat. The first state is the ventral vagal system, the state of social engagement. This is the physiological ground of connection, curiosity, and emotional availability. It is the state in which learning happens, in which relationships are built, in which a child can hear your voice as something safe. The second state is the sympathetic activation most people recognize as fight or flight. Elevated cortisol, accelerated heart rate, the child who screams and resists and slams the door. That state is distressing to be around, but it is, neurologically speaking, communicative. A child in fight or flight is still fighting for the relationship. They are still in the arena. The third state, and the one most relevant to the silence we are describing, is what Porges identified as dorsal vagal shutdown. This is the freeze. When the emotional load becomes too high or too chronic, the nervous system does not escalate further. It does the opposite. It collapses inward. It conserves resources. It disconnects from the present experience to protect the organism from a level of pain it has no other means of metabolizing. Research published by the Harvard Center on the Developing Child has documented that children exposed to persistent relational stress, particularly stress originating from the primary caregiver, show measurable changes in both the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, enters a state of sustained hyperactivation. Simultaneously, the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for reasoning, emotional regulation, and the capacity for nuanced communication, functionally suppresses. The child standing in front of you in silence is not choosing to withhold a response. Their brain has physiologically restricted the capacity to produce one. The blankness you are reading as defiance is the external sign of a nervous system that has gone into containment mode. This pattern has deep roots in attachment research. John Bowlby's foundational work at the Tavistock Institute and Mary Ainsworth's subsequent strange situation experiments at Johns Hopkins University in the 1970s established the concept of the secure base, the idea that a child's entire self-regulatory system develops in relationship to a caregiver who is consistently available and emotionally responsive. Ainsworth's experiments identified a specific attachment pattern she described as disorganized, observed in children who, when stressed, could find no reliable strategy for seeking comfort from their caregiver. Unable to approach, unable to retreat, they froze. They went still. They dissociated from the moment rather than engage with it. Critically, this pattern was not caused by dramatic neglect or abuse in most cases. It emerged from inconsistency, from caregiving that was sometimes warm and sometimes frightening, sometimes present and sometimes withdrawn. The nervous system simply cannot organize itself around a source of comfort that also functions as a source of threat. If this science is reframing something you have been carrying about your child's behavior, press like. It tells us this kind of evidence-based content belongs in front of more families. Subscribe to Nurtured Minds. Every week we go this deep into the developing brain, because the science of childhood deserves the same rigor we give to everything else. Here is the specific distinction that separates a developmental difficulty from something that requires immediate attention. A child who screams during discipline, who argues, who cries and bargains and pushes back, even a child who is genuinely exhausting to parent, is showing you a nervous system that is still engaged. Fight or flight means the child still believes the connection is worth fighting for. They are protesting because protest feels like it might change something. That is not the problem. That is the system working as it should, even when it does not feel that way from the outside. The clinical red flag is the opposite, a child who has stopped protesting entirely, a child who receives punishment without visible distress, who shrugs when something meaningful is taken away, who walks to the corner, sits through the consequence, and waits for it to end. Not because they have matured into emotional regulation, but because they have concluded that their internal state has no meaningful impact on what happens next. Developmental psychologists call this learned helplessness, a concept first systematically described by Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania through a series of behavioral studies later extended to human development. Learned helplessness occurs when an organism experiences repeated outcomes that feel disconnected from its own responses. Over time, the brain stops generating attempts to influence the environment, not from inability, but from a learned conviction that the attempt is pointless. In children, learned helplessness does not announce itself loudly. It arrives in the quiet, in the child who used to fight and now does not, in the absence of tears where tears once came easily, in the hollowness of a compliance that looks, from the outside, like maturity, but is actually the behavioral signature of a child who has stopped believing that being heard is possible. Research from Stanford's Center for Education Policy Analysis has found that children who develop early patterns of emotional disengagement from caregivers carry those patterns forward into the peer relationships of middle school, into the romantic relationships of early adulthood, into their own future caregiving. The silence in your child's room is not the end of a power struggle. It is the nervous system broadcasting, and the only frequency it has left, that it has run out of reasons to keep trying. The only response that actually reaches them. The path back does not run through a better consequence. It runs through the nervous system itself. A child in dorsal vagal shutdown cannot be reasoned with, cannot be disciplined into engagement, and cannot be reached through escalation, because the very circuits that would allow them to process and respond to those inputs have been suppressed. The first and only move that has neurological traction is to reactivate the social engagement system, and that requires a complete change of posture, not just tone. In practice, this means entering the room without an agenda, sitting at the child's level rather than standing over them, releasing the immediate need to address the behavior and instead addressing the state. Not because the behavior is unimportant, but because behavior is downstream of state, and you cannot change the behavior of a nervous system that is in shutdown by talking to the behavior. You have to talk to the state first. Something as simple and as structurally significant as, "I am not here right now to correct you. I am just here." That sentence, delivered with a regulated voice and physical proximity, is not softness. It is the most precise neurological intervention available to a parent in that moment. It communicates, through the channels the social engagement system is actually listening on, that the threat is past, that the relationship is not contingent on compliance, and that the child's internal experience matters to you even when their behavior does not. A 2019 longitudinal study from the University of California, Davis, tracked parent-child interaction patterns across 10 years and found that caregivers who consistently followed conflict with attunement and repair, without abandoning accountability, raised children with significantly stronger emotional regulation, lower anxiety, and fewer conduct difficulties by mid-adolescence. The repair does not erase the rupture. It teaches the nervous system that ruptures are survivable, that the relationship is bigger than any single episode of conflict. That warmth is not something that disappears and never comes back. Over time, that accumulated experience of return is what keeps the child's system from defaulting to shut down the next time the pressure rises. The silence your child offers you is not the absence of communication. It is communication at its most exhausted, stripped of protest, stripped of hope, reduced to the barest possible signal. I am still here, but I've stopped expecting to be found. Your role is not to punish that signal into something louder. Your role is to sit close enough, and stay long enough, and come back reliably enough, that reaching toward you begins to feel worth the risk again. If something in this video landed for you, leave it in the comments. We read every one. If you know a parent who has stood in that doorway and felt nothing back, share this with them. And if you want to go further, the next video on this channel follows what happens inside the adolescent brain when early emotional shutdown goes unaddressed for years. It is the direct continuation of everything we covered here, and it will answer questions you may not have known you were carrying. Like this video, subscribe to Nurtured Minds, and we will see you there.